First of all, I'd like to thank you for accepting the invitation this evening. I was keen to meet with as many of you as possible for two primary reasons. The first is to share some insight into the change that's happening in my country, in Syria, and specifically the primary and the central role that culture is playing in the way that we plan and see the change evolving. Within that context, I'd of course like to comment and give you my own perspectives of the cooperation between our two countries in this regard. But I also realize that I'm sitting in a room with an elite group of French intellectuals, practitioners, and thinkers in the topic at hand this evening. So as much as I would like to share my own perspectives with you, I'm hoping this evening can be a dialogue in which I can also benefit from your own insights and your own perspectives. So I'm looking forward to a healthy and honest question and answer debate type of an evening. I'm going to start by giving you a little bit of insight into Syria. And I appreciate that most of the audience here this evening knows that Syria is a modern nation, but also one that has a rich history. It has seen, shaped, and been shaped by thousands of years of civilizations and cultures over a long period of time. You of course know that between Damascus and Aleppo, we have the oldest continuously inhabited city in the world and the oldest inhabited capital in the world. The first phonetic alphabet, the first musical note, and the origins of agriculture, to name but a few. Today, many visitors come to Syria, some academic and knowledgeable like yourselves, others adventurous and curious, wanting to see for themselves the physical evidence left behind through thousands of years of human interaction. But for Syrians, for us locals, this heritage has a much more personal meaning. For a country that has such a vast and diverse history, it's not so much the hardware, the artifacts, and the architecture that make up who we are and define our character and personality, but it's rather the software, the accumulation and interweaving of thousands of years' worth of values, customs, habits, traditions. That essentially, for us, this is what these physical objects represent. So in that context, these artifacts have a very real, direct, and emotional attachment to the Syrian population. They embody our spirit of openness and engagement. And if anything, they show us that in the world that is currently changing and evolving so quickly, I like to refer to them as our compass or our anchor. So regardless of where we go and which direction we head, we have a solid and sound footing that keeps us firmly rooted. The culture has evolved and the society has evolved. It has learned to interact. Again, as I said, over thousands of years of different cultures and civilization. I like to think of it as flowing water. If the water flows, it's constantly refreshed, it's clean, it benefits from new perspectives and new insights. Water that doesn't flow becomes stagnant, stale, old, and disease-infested. So, if anything, as I said, the culture in Syria is constantly renewing itself, and the society in Syria is constantly renewing itself. It's open and it's diverse. Some often ask me, how then can Syria remain stable, moderate, and influential in a region that is increasingly being surrounded by extremism, ideologism, sectarianism, and all other forms of negative perceptions in our society? The typical answer I get is because of military, political, security reasons. Again, I believe I have a different view. It's the very essence of our culture. It's what our history teaches us of openness and engagement. It's the sense of identity and pride that we have, knowing who we are in the world and knowing what we've contributed to the world over thousands of years, that gives us that sense of stability and that sense of moderation. The world, as you all know, is changing, and it's changing at an extremely rapid pace. Now, we have one of two options. We can either try and protect ourselves, try and protect the very essence of who we are, and in a way have an inward-looking approach, or we can be active. We can willingly and openly say that we're not going to allow external forces, negative forces, to influence and tarnish the very values and characteristics that essentially make us who we are. And of course, we choose the latter. We choose to engage, we choose to continue to be open, but more importantly, we choose to show that in the region we live in, moderation and stability is the only way that we can continue to prosper and develop as a nation. Some of you may think that I'm talking politics. Indeed, we live in a highly politicized region and in highly politicized times. But trust me, I have no interest in politics. My interests lie elsewhere. But living in the region for as long as I have, I realize that politics fundamentally affects every facet of our lives. It affects every facet of our lives, but yet it doesn't provide us with the tools required to be able to develop the modern nation and the modern society that we wish to be. Without education, without culture, without open economies, we won't be able to continue to develop in the modern world. So as I said, it may seem as though I'm talking politics, but for me, it's fundamentally about the very essence of culture and what culture can provide in the modern world today. It becomes even more important, though, when for a country like Syria that is going through rapid change, economically and socially, that we have to think of culture as being the core of everything we try to do. In the globalized and often homogenized world we live in, with a very dominant English language, but also a very dominant Anglo-Saxon culture, and with all its positives, it remains one of many. It becomes extremely difficult for nations like Syria and nations like France to continue to diversify or enrich the diversity of our national identities. And this is crucial if we're to continue to survive and continue to play an influential role in our region. And it's for that reason that we have placed culture as the primary, at the heart of everything we're trying to do in developing Syria today. As I said earlier, the country is going through remarkable change across all fronts. Economically, the economy is opening up. We are diversifying. Just a couple of years ago, private banks didn't exist. Recently, a stock exchange has opened. We are the only country in the Middle East to have legislation that regulates microfinance and microcredit. We're in the process of finalizing SME legislation. So across the economic front, many, many changes are happening. And I'd like to hope that these changes are not just aimed at the big national companies, but rather are encouraging the smaller businesses, the medium-sized enterprises. And as such, the growth that we're looking for is not just a measurement of statistics and numbers, but actually a growth that is inclusive to the entire population. Our education system is completely being overhauled. We realize that in a modern economy and in a modern society, education has to be relevant. And at the pace that the world is changing, it's sometimes hard to keep up with that change. I remember when I studied computer science, by the time I'd graduated, half the programming languages that I had been taught at university had become redundant by the time I was looking for a job. So the focus on our education system is not only the knowledge and the information that our students need to gain, but it's increasingly the skills and the attitudes that will ensure that they're able to compete and create the opportunities required for our country to flourish in the 21st century. Where does culture fit into all of this? The country, as I said, with its vast and rapid development, can't lose sight of the very essence of who we are. If we develop and become a nation that no longer has its identity and no longer has a sense of its being, I believe we fundamentally lost the most valuable asset we have. And once it's gone, it's impossible for it to return. 3 years ago, the Syrian government embarked on an ambitious vision to incorporate culture in the way that we plan and see for the change that's happening in the country. What do I mean by that specifically? We have 5,000 historic monuments spread across the country, over 30 museums, hundreds of artifacts, thousands of artifacts, in fact. And we can either choose to look at these artifacts and everything they represent, or this history and everything it represents, by looking in the past, so looking backwards and trying to move forwards, or we can look forward, but keep our eye on the rearview mirror. And this is essentially what we have embarked on 3 years ago. The vision that we hope to launch in April has 5 core components at the heart. One is that the story of Syria, which essentially is the story for me, it represents not just the story of Syria, but actually the story of humanity, is to be told and to be reflected in a way that not just today's generation, but future generations can continue to benefit and realize and gain strength from the rich heritage that we have. I don't mean this in a static manner, in the sense that there's a disconnection between the history of the past and the reality of today. Quite the opposite. And as I said, there's a very direct and real relationship between the artifacts of Syria's past and the spirit of openness and engagement of its people today. And that's something that we need to safeguard, and it's not something I believe we need to build. The archaeological sites that Syria is, and as we think about economic growth and economic prosperity, they provide us with a network of incredibly rich assets for us to think about how regional development and regional growth can benefit. And here I'm not specifically looking directly at the potential for tourism and the potential for mass tourism or marketing, but I'm actually looking at the potential for local human development. When we continue to develop our communities, our local communities, and we continue to to make a bridge between the artifacts of the past and the society that we live in, these artifacts don't remain artifacts of the past. They become artifacts and are very much abundant in our society today. As I said earlier, Damascus is the oldest continuously inhabited city in the world. That is no small feat. It takes effort to keep that city alive, to keep its residents alive and living inside it. And those of you who visited will see that what makes it special is the butcher and the grocer and the schools and the families going about their day-to-day lives. Intermingled with all of that, of course, is the increase in tourism, and it's the increase in interest globally for what Syria has to offer. But fundamentally, it's based on keeping those local communities alive and keeping them attached to the very essence of our history and our culture. Buildings are important, whether they're historic or modern. But I believe that without the human potential, without human capabilities, and without the human passion and power, these buildings remain architectural splendors of the past. The second core element of what we're trying to achieve in Syria is developing our human capability and our human capacity. 60% of our population is under 25. And some often say to me, how are you going to deal with this challenge? I don't see it as a challenge. I see it as our biggest opportunity, and the opportunity for us to be able to develop a nation that we can be proud of, that has built and is built on the pride of the country and the history that we have. But that population needs to be empowered. It needs to be involved in the change and the economic opportunities that are evolving and increasingly being apparent in the country. For them to be involved, they need the right training, they need the right access to employment, and they need the right access to credit. Culture has the opportunity to provide at least some of these spheres of interaction. I've been talking this morning or yesterday with some of the French institutions as to how we can develop the potential and develop the human capabilities that we have in Syria to be able to increase the opportunities for employment and increase the opportunities for enterprise around our cultural and historic sites. So I've spoken a little bit about the role that culture has in our society. I've spoken a little bit about the role or the way that we need to develop the human capacity and the human potential that we have, and that the importance of that the significance of that in terms of the cultural renaissance that we're going through at the moment. And they're both important. One, I cannot succeed without the other. There is a third element, and that is the role that museums play in our modern history, in our society, and in the way that we interpret our history. Many of you have been to Syria, and whereas you are astounded by the artifacts that you see in the museums, the comment I always hear is, but the building could be better. And that's a polite or diplomatic comment that I get. Now, we realize that having such a vast and diverse range of artifacts, and during our last assessment, we realized that there are over 150,000 pieces of unique grade A quality artifacts. Most of them have not been seen in public. They're in storage, and they need to be brought up into the open. So another facet of this initiative is to develop the museums of the country. The museum in Damascus being the national museum, but also, as I said, the importance of what we're trying to do is regional growth and regional prosperity. So we will not lose sight of the fact that there are museums spread all around the country, and they too need to be incorporated into what we're doing. The museums and the way we see them, we're in discussions at the moment to see how this can be developed into a network. And by network, I don't mean a collection of buildings and institutions gathered under one umbrella. I mean a network that can collectively tell the story of Syria, that can collectively share the artifacts, but more importantly, promote the values, the inherent values that make us who we are today. This is a vision that we embarked on 3 years ago. And I remember during my last visit to Paris in 2008, and during the meetings that we had where I had with the Louvre and with Monsieur Loiret, I discussed the opportunity of developing our long-standing and albeit small scale, if you allow, small scale relationship to a much higher level. And of course, Monsieur Loiret appreciated and understood the significance of what Syria has to offer in terms of its diversity and in terms of its history and its heritage. And whereas some nations today are trying to create culture from scratch, we realize that France and Syria are very developed and sophisticated nations in this regard. And the opportunity for partnership and complementarity is vast. In France, you have some of the best institutions for interpreting and studying the past. And in Syria, we have some of the best laboratories and research materials. And so, if anything, we need you as much as you need us. The Louvre team has been working in Syria since then, and I'm happy to say that the contribution that they have made has been significant in helping us formalize and finalize the vision that will be launched in April. The relationships during this period, during the last 2 years between our two countries have warmed, and they have significantly increased, and I obviously hope that this will continue. In France, we see, as in Syria, a proud, cultured nation, a nation that is influential in Europe. And I would like to say, if you allow, influential not just because of the savviness of your politicians, but also because of the history and the heritage that you have and the respect that that heritage and that history provides you amongst the other European countries. At the beginning of this year, as Monsieur Mitterrand mentioned, a government-to-government partnership was signed to cement the relationship further. It incorporates the work of the Louvre, but also encourages other institutions to participate in a partnership which I feel is significant to both our two countries. And here I'd like to also emphasize the fact that I believe we've learned from a lesson past. In the past, we tended to put our eggs into one basket. If the politics was going well, then everything else was going well. If the politics was going through a downturn, then nothing else was happening. And so the lesson that we've learned by cementing this relationship and by ensuring that it's a government-to-government relationship is that there is sustainability, and we are able to safeguard ourselves amongst the prevailing political winds, which, as you know, will change according to circumstance. April is the month where we are hoping to launch the initiative, and we are looking forward to having our French partners involved, not just as guests, but involved in the unveiling of what we're trying to achieve. Up until April, we'll be signing with other governments and other institutions as part of our view that this project, whilst Syrian and being delivered by Syria, but actually as it represents the story of human history, can only benefit from these collaborations. And it's the spirit of these collaborations that I'd like to focus on in my last comment. In the world we live in today, and over the past 10 years, two words have been reoccurring in our daily dialect: extremism and terrorism. And with these words, we hear a multitude of approaches as how best to deal with them. The military approach has proven to be a complete failure, and if anything, in my opinion, completely counterproductive to what we need to achieve. Some proponents of this approach have moved on to more enlightened forms of nation building, which includes education and development. But I'd like to argue that unless we include culture in what we're trying to achieve, I don't believe that we'll be able to build the future that we all aspire to. And here, just to give it into contrast, it's like knowing how to, it's the difference between knowing how to use a computer and what that can provide you, vis-a-vis knowing and understanding how a computer works. And it's only when you understand how the computer works that you're able to influence and affect and support its efficiency, its speed, and its direction. So as significant and as important as education is, as development is, as economic prosperity is, it's only when we put culture at the very heart of what we're trying to achieve that I think we'll be able to produce the fertile soil that we're looking for. Ultimately, culture embraces our human values. It nurtures our human spirit. But more importantly, it reminds us of our shared humanity. I'd like to, as I said when I started, I'd like for this to be a dialogue rather than a monologue. I hope that I have spoken enough, or I've spoken broadly in a way that has given you some insight into Syria, into the changes that are happening, and more specifically, the cultural change that's happening in my country. But as I said, the other main part of meeting with you this evening is to hear your insights, to hear your perspectives, and to take questions that you may have on anything that I've said. So, thank you.
Qui pose une question après ce discours très riche? Allez-y, Monsieur Wright.
José.
No, I tell it in English. I mean, it's in all the discussions we had since the beginning, speaking of the role of museums today, you insist on the fact that a museum is not only a place where you display works of art, and in your case, very beautiful works of art, but it's also a place which, in the city today, plays a central role. In terms of a social role, but also a very important role in terms of education. Is it something you can develop thinking to the future National Museum in Damascus?
Thank you for the question, because you remind me that when we talk about museums and the number of museums we have in the country, we can't forget that actually Syria is one big museum in the artifacts and in the archaeological sites that are present in the country. What is important then is that the relationship between these artifacts and these architectural sites there's a direct connection between them and between the citizens of today. I often go to Palmyra, and I'm amazed constantly by the magnificence of that site. But then when I talk to the locals, the residents of the community, they look at me and they say, well, this is our back garden. And in a way, this is important, because for them, it's not that they underestimate what Palmyra is and the significance of it, but they feel that this is a part of who they are today. As I mentioned, Monsieur Loiret, as we continue to reform our education system and put skills at the core of what we're trying to do, we're also reforming our approach to citizenship, in the sense that for Syria's change to be sustainable, it needs to be done by Syrians for Syrians. And with a young population, there is plenty of energy and plenty of passion for that to happen. The museums will provide an opportunity for us not just to reflect on our past, but also to think of how that past can be brought or used to develop our nation tomorrow. And here it's the difference between, if this doesn't happen, we end up having a legacy of incredible buildings that tell a lovely story of the past, but a reality that is very, very different, and a reality that is potentially could be dogged, as I said, by extremism or sectarianism or any kind of narrow-minded ideologies. And so education here is crucial to ensure that we teach our younger generation the spirit of openness and engagement, that have historically defined who we are as a people, as a society.
Vous savez, madame, le patrimoine culturel n'est pas tout à fait le premier intérêt des courants fondamentalistes. On a vu ça dans le monde. Et la Syrie, de par ses données démographiques, est à majorité musulmane. Et pourtant, son environnement témoigne d'une montée croissante des extrémismes religieux et des fondamentalismes à outrance. La Syrie est un pays laïque. Le système est laïque, le système de l'éducation est laïque. Comment la Syrie, avec cette vision future de la culture, va gérer cet environnement, cette réalité et son système laïque? Merci.
I'd like to disagree with you if you don't mind. Our system is not secular. Our society is secular. And the secular nation, the secular nature of our society comes from the very fact that the religions, the birthplace of religions came from the Middle East. And the birthplace of religions came from the Middle East, but also from Syria. And whereas in other countries and other societies, there is a sense of pride in the coexistence and the tolerance that exists. And I hear this often from people that come to Syria, and they compliment me and say that your society has such great coexistence and such great tolerance. But actually, I disagree with this notion. Coexistence and tolerance is important, but it's important to societies that need it. To a society like Syria, we reject it. We feel that we are beyond these notions. And here, what I mean specifically, when you coexist with something, you're essentially bringing two elements that are very different together. And you're trying to find a way for these elements to live or to coexist in a peaceful manner. Whereas in Syria, the religions are part of our identity, of our human spirit. And so it's impossible for you to say, or for me to say to you, that how does my left leg coexist with my right hand? What do I mean specifically? The Umayyad Mosque. The Umayyad Mosque is one of the most important Islamic monuments for the Muslim world. But for Syria, for Christians and Muslims, it is a part of our heritage. We learn about the significance of the Umayyad Mosque in our history books. And as such, Christian Muslims are proud of the mosque, as are Muslims. When we pray in the mosque, we pray in front of St. John, the tomb of St. John the Baptist. So every Muslim praying in this mosque, and again, it's the third most holy mosque in the world for Islam, prays in front of the tomb of a Christian saint. Likewise, Ma'lula, where we still speak the language of Christ, Straight Street. These are, these for me, they define who we are as a people. This is part of our identity. We learn these elements in our history books, not in religious studies. And as such, Christianity and Islam together define who we are as a people. And that's where our secular society comes from. Historically, today, and of course we need to make sure that it continues into the future.
Thank you very much for that amazing talk. The question that comes up is a little bit provocative. Is culture in some way a gateway for a more peaceful time in the region?
Make the mistake of believing that culture is the solution to everything. There needs to be a culture of peace in the region, for peace treaties to be signed, and for them to work. So you need a culture of peace beforehand, then you need a peace treaty, and then you need a culture of peace to be able to live a normal existence and a normal life. The problems in the Middle East are problems associated with occupation and problems associated with rights. So as such, the challenge is not cultural as much as it is rights abuse and occupied land. Now, that doesn't mean that culture can't play a role. In fact, it does play a role. In Syria, despite the conflict and despite the fact that we live in a region that is in constant turmoil and constant instability, our nation still believes that peace is the only solution. And so the culture of peace that exists in the country is the impetus for us to be able to engage with like-minded governments to be able to reach a treaty. Now, once that treaty is signed, you need a culture of peace beyond that to be able to ensure that it doesn't remain ink on paper, but actually affects and brings the promises of sustainable peace. But I don't think we should mix the two. You may ask me, do we see a partner in this process? Like I said, the country that I represent believes that peace is the only solution to the region, and as such, we embrace peace, we need peace. But for that peace to become a reality, there needs to be a culture of peace in the region as a whole for that reality to happen.
Good evening. I was very much impressed by your definition of heritage, social definition of heritage, and everywhere in Syria. And I was very much impressed by what you are launching for Syria in the coming April. One question is necessary to be asked, provocative maybe, is how to deal with, let's say, the power of money. It means if you define heritage in a large way, you have, as you said exactly, you have areas in the cities, culture of some communities, etc., which has to be protected. Now, one of the most developing sectors in Syria is the real estate. And you have the power of money coming and saying, let's take this out or this out. And you have, as UNESCO is saying, some endangered places, Faisal Street in Damascus or whatever. And UNESCO put the light, red light, on some of these issues. So how to deal with this, beside the other cultural or identity issues? How to deal with the money, the power of money?
Well, if we had more money, we'd be able to do more in our cultural development program, but that's a slightly different topic. The issues that you've talked about, the price of real estate specifically, is focused at the big cities. Now, the network of archaeological sites that exists around the country, the 5,000 archaeological sites that exist around the country, are spread across the whole nation. And whereas we may see spikes in real estate in one city, we're not seeing them everywhere else. When I mentioned the fact that as our economy grows and as we continue to diversify, we need to think about inclusive growth rather than just continue to raise the statistic. So 6% vis-a-vis 7 or 8% is not really the measure we're looking for. It's how inclusive that growth is across the society. The very direct relationship, as I said, between Syria's people and the artifacts that are in our backyard, so to speak, is the first element of protection, because they represent, they are the guardians of this heritage. And whereas we may not have the resources required to be able to renovate and restore all the artifacts and all the architecture, we at least have enough custodians to make sure that they're not demolished or destroyed in a manner that is not representative of who we are. But fundamentally, as I said, the very vision, the very essence of the vision we're trying to promote is that this cultural heritage is it's the heart of everything we're trying to do. So it's not happening in parallel to economic development and in parallel to education reform and in parallel to civil society expansion and participation. It's happening as a core of all these facets together.
Nous sommes à peu près parvenus au terme du temps que nous nous étions fixés. Et si vous le permettez, Madame, nous allons maintenant envisager d'aller à la réception. Je voudrais vraiment, en notre nom à tous, vous remercier pour cette vision de la Syrie et d'une Syrie en mouvement, d'une vision encourageante, optimiste, politique au meilleur sens du terme, et qui à tous, je crois, nous a appris beaucoup sur la Syrie, appris beaucoup sur ce qui se passe en Syrie. Merci, Madame.
Merci, merci.
Madame la Première Dame de la République arabe syrienne, Madame la Ministre, Monsieur le Ministre, Altesse, Mesdames et Messieurs les Présidents, Mesdames et Messieurs les Ambassadeurs, chers amis, au nom de Son Altesse l'Aga-Khan, Président du Conseil d'administration de l'Académie diplomatique internationale, je vous souhaite la bienvenue dans les locaux historiques de l'Académie diplomatique. L'Académie est une très ancienne institution. Elle a été créée en 1926 par le ministre français des Affaires étrangères de l'époque, M. Aristide Briand, pour être un lieu de dialogue, d'échange et de réflexion sur la vie internationale. Créée à peu près en même temps que le Council on Foreign Relations à New York et Chatham House à Londres, elle a été en son temps ce que nous appellerions aujourd'hui un think tank au service du dialogue entre les nations, de la paix et du droit international. Elle retrouve aujourd'hui, à l'initiative de Son Altesse l'Aga-Khan et de ses 94 États membres, sa vocation initiale, celle d'être un lieu d'accueil, de réflexion et de débat pour tous ceux qui intéressent les questions internationales. Madame la Première Dame de la République arabe syrienne, en vous accueillant aujourd'hui à l'Académie diplomatique internationale, cette institution traditionnellement vouée à la célébration de la diplomatie classique, celle qui traite des intérêts, de la puissance et des équilibres, a bien conscience de donner la parole à une nouvelle forme de diplomatie. La diplomatie culturelle qui s'affirme aujourd'hui comme une des formes modernes, intelligentes, populaires des relations internationales, une diplomatie des cultures vouée au rapprochement des peuples, une diplomatie qui enseigne le désir de connaître et de se comprendre, le respect et la curiosité des autres, le sens de l'échange et de la coopération. En consacrant, Madame, beaucoup de votre temps et en prenant l'initiative dans le domaine de la coopération culturelle, et notamment entre la Syrie et la France, entre le Louvre et l'administration syrienne des musées, en engageant aujourd'hui avec dynamisme l'exceptionnel patrimoine de votre pays, en mobilisant le talent et la créativité traditionnelle des Syriens, vous nous faites pressentir que l'entente entre les nations et la paix se joue aussi, et se jouera sans doute de plus en plus sur la culture, sur l'échange des idées, sur le dialogue des arts et des sensibilités. Merci, Madame la Première Dame de la République arabe syrienne, pour votre présence parmi nous, pour votre action au service de la coopération et de la culture. Je vais donner la parole à Monsieur le Ministre de la Culture et de la Communication.
Excellences, Madame la Première Dame Asma al-Assad, Halan wa Salan fi Paris. Mesdames et Messieurs les ambassadeurs, Mesdames et Messieurs les ministres, chères Madame, chers amis, Je vois d'ailleurs dans cette salle beaucoup de visages et de talents syriens qui se sont venus parmi d'autres visages amis et talents français. Et déjà, toute cette assemblée témoigne de la qualité de l'échange auquel vous nous avez conviés, chère madame. Votre visite de travail aux côtés du président de la République syrienne constitue une très belle occasion pour que nous réfléchissions ensemble aux moyens d'approfondir une coopération culturelle déjà très vive. Votre vision, votre engagement pour la culture syrienne qui vient s'ajouter à votre attachement aux questions de développement, d'éducation, de mobilisation de la société civile, font de vous l'interlocutrice aussi précieuse qu'indispensable à laquelle j'ai l'honneur de m'adresser ce soir et que nous avons l'honneur d'écouter dans un instant. La coopération culturelle franco-syrienne porte en son cœur une volonté commune de valoriser le patrimoine exceptionnel qui est le vôtre, dont la valeur universelle pour l'histoire de l'humanité a été à maintes reprises reconnue par l'UNESCO, dont vous avez d'ailleurs ratifié en 2008 la Convention sur la diversité culturelle, signe supplémentaire, s'il en était besoin, de nos convergences de vues. Aujourd'hui encore, ce sont plus de 30 missions archéologiques françaises et franco-syriennes qui sont poursuivies dans votre pays. Aux côtés du sanctuaire byzantin de Saint-Siméon s'ajoutent les noms légendaires de Palmyre, Ougarit, Marie, par exemple, autant de références qui dépassent largement le champ des spécialistes pour s'inscrire dans une histoire partagée de la civilisation urbaine. Depuis l'expédition d'Ernest Renan sous le Second Empire, notre coopération culturelle s'est ancrée dans une histoire déjà longue, dans laquelle on peut rappeler les institutions créées pendant la période du mandat de la SDN. Je veux parler par exemple du service des antiquités, des musées de Damas et d'Alep, de la restauration de monuments comme le Krach des Chevaliers ou encore des fouilles archéologiques de Ras Shamra ou Garit. Autant d'éléments qui ont été repris et encadrés dans l'accord culturel de 1971 qui a structuré notre action commune en impliquant les services et les établissements publics de mon ministère. Je pense notamment au Louvre, à l'école du Louvre ou encore à l'Institut national du patrimoine. Je tiens à rappeler que c'est votre implication personnelle, chère Madame Al-Assad, qui a permis l'élargissement de la coopération entre le Louvre et la Direction générale de l'archéologie et des musées de Syrie. Au-delà de la rénovation des départements des antiquités orientales et des arts islamiques du Musée national de Damas, pour repenser l'ensemble, grâce à vous, du système muséal syrien. Votre époux, le président de la République, a d'ailleurs tenu en 2009, lors de sa précédente visite, à faire de cette coopération une priorité de nos relations bilatérales. C'est cette volonté partagée, animée par vous, Madame la Première Dame, cette volonté d'approfondir ces liens qui ont abouti en février dernier à la signature de notre accord intergouvernemental portant sur la muséographie et le patrimoine par les premiers ministres Naji Otri et François Fillon. Je suis d'ailleurs particulièrement heureux de saluer la présence parmi nous ce soir de M. Henri Loiret, qui a évidemment contribué énormément à la réalisation de cet accord. À ce titre, je suis personnellement très fier, en tant que ministre de la Culture et de la Communication, de la confiance personnelle que vous avez bien voulu placer dans le Louvre et l'Institut national du patrimoine. Ces deux grandes institutions culturelles françaises, via un groupement d'intérêt public qui implique également notre ministère des Affaires étrangères, vont jouer un rôle important dans la redéfinition de l'action muséale syrienne à laquelle vous aurez tant contribué, qu'il s'agisse de sa décentralisation ou de la création de musées de région, une perspective à laquelle je suis évidemment très attaché et pour laquelle je suis très sensible au fait qu'elle se développe en Syrie. Soyez sûre, chère Madame, du plein soutien de mon ministère, de nos institutions, mais aussi de l'opinion publique française, du plein soutien à votre ambition si concrète et si forte de rénovation du système muséal syrien, porte ouverte, bien sûr, sur d'autres coopérations culturelles entre nos deux pays, telles que la formation pour les personnels, l'architecture, etc., etc. Pour finir, je voudrais dire un mot pour vous assurer de l'importance que le président de la République française, représenté ici par son conseiller, M. Garando, attache à la qualité de la relation franco-syrienne, tant en termes de développement, avec notamment la convention d'établissement de l'Agence française de développement en 2009, que de stabilité régionale, dans laquelle la Syrie joue à l'évidence un rôle essentiel. De même pour l'avancement du volet culturel de l'Union pour la Méditerranée. C'est bien sûr dans le cadre de cette vision globale que notre coopération culturelle prend tout son sens. Je vous remercie pour votre attention.
Madame la Première Dame, you have the floor.
Merci. Bonsoir. Je suis bien contente de venir encore voir à Paris. C'est une ville dont je marque, c'est une ville dont je garde beaucoup de bons souvenirs. Mes visites y étaient fréquentes et magiques. D'abord, quand j'étais petite, pour visiter ma famille, puis durant ma jeunesse, libre de soucis, et suivant comme banquière, travaillant dans l'investissement et menant une vie plus sérieuse. Cette fois-ci encore, nous avons amené nos enfants avec nous pour que leurs propres souvenirs d'enfance soient également marqués par Paris. Mesdames et messieurs, vous l'avez déjà remarqué, je ne maîtrise plus le français comme avant. Permettez-moi donc de continuer en anglais. Je pense que ce sera dans votre intérêt comme dans le mien.